There were 4 of them, and they came from a city that smelled of salt and engine oil and the particular kind of damp that settles into brick when you're that close to the Irish Sea. Liverpool in the 1950s was a port city, which meant it was a city of arrivals and departures, of merchant sailors who brought back records from America, 45s wrapped in brown paper, rhythm and blues and rock and roll that you couldn't hear on the BBC. The music came across the water before it came through any official channel. It came in suitcases and duffel bags, and it reached the teenage boys who gathered in youth clubs and church halls with a kind of illicit electricity, the feeling that something was happening somewhere else, and if you listened carefully enough you might catch the signal. John Lennon was born in 1940, during an air raid, which he would later claim gave him a sense of the dramatic from the very beginning. His father was a merchant seaman who disappeared for long stretches and then disappeared altogether. His mother, Julia, was a bright, musical woman who played the banjo and loved to laugh, but she gave John over to her sister Mimi to raise when he was 5 years old. Mimi was stern and practical and ran a tight household on Menlove Avenue in a respectable suburb called Woolton. She believed in discipline and education and keeping up appearances. Julia lived nearby and would visit, bringing with her a kind of chaotic warmth that must have felt both thrilling and unbearable to a boy trying to understand why he couldn't live with her. She taught him banjo chords, she encouraged the wildness that Mimi tried to contain, and then in 1958, when John was 17, Julia was struck and killed by a car driven by an off-duty police officer, and the world collapsed in a way that never quite reassembled itself. Paul McCartney was born in 1942, the son of a cotton salesman and a midwife. His mother Mary was the steady center of the family, the one who worked nights and kept everything together, and when she died of breast cancer in 1956, when Paul was 14, the loss was absolute. His father Jim was a pianist who had played in a jazz band in the 20s, and there was always music in the house, a piano in the front room, melodies from another era. Jim McCartney believed in trying, in making something of yourself, in the possibility of improvement. He wanted his sons to speak properly, to have opportunities he hadn't had. Paul absorbed all of this, the loss, the music, the aspiration, and it made him both sentimental and ferociously ambitious. A boy who could write a ballad that would break your heart and who would also make sure everyone knew he'd written it. George Harrison was the youngest, born in 1943 into a family that was warm and working class and Catholic. His father Harold drove a bus. His mother Louise kept house and doted on her youngest boy. George was quiet, watchful, with a kind of dry humor that could puncture pretension. He was also obsessed with guitars from an early age, learning chords until his fingers bled, practicing with a patience that the others would sometimes lack. He was the one who had to prove himself, being younger, being the third songwriter in a band that already had 2 geniuses. That position, always slightly outside, always having to earn his place, would shape everything he did. Richard Starkey was born in 1940 in the Dingle, the rough end of Liverpool, into poverty that was real and grinding. His parents separated when he was small. He was sick for much of his childhood, peritonitis at 6, which put him in a coma for weeks, then tuberculosis at 13, which kept him in a sanatorium for 2 years. He missed so much school that he never really learned to read with ease. But he could play the drums. In the hospital, the staff organized a hospital band to help with rehabilitation, and someone handed him a set of drumsticks and he found the thing he could do. He played simply, solidly, always in service of the song. He wasn't flashy, he was reliable, and he had a face that was both mournful and kind, and a way of speaking that was drily funny without trying to be. His name was Richie, but by the time he joined the band everyone called him Ringo because of the rings he wore on his fingers. The music that reached them in Liverpool in the mid-50s was American, and it was black and it was called rock and roll, though that name was just a way of making it acceptable to white teenagers. Little Richard screaming, Chuck Berry's guitar, Elvis Presley's sneer, and swivel, these were the transmissions that disrupted the bland decorum of post-war British pop. John Lennon heard it and felt recognized. Here was aggression and sex and humor and a kind of anarchic joy that matched the anger he carried around after his mother's death. Paul McCartney heard it and understood immediately that it was learnable, that the songs had structures you could take apart and study, that you could do this if you were clever and worked hard enough. George Harrison heard it and wanted to know how to make that sound come out of a guitar. There was, briefly, a fad called skiffle, which was a kind of homemade folk music, easy to play because you didn't need expensive instruments. You could use a washboard and a tea-chest bass and an acoustic guitar, and you could play Leadbelly and Lonnie Donegan songs in youth clubs and school concerts. Every boy in Liverpool seemed to be in a skiffle group for about 18 months. John Lennon started one called the Quarrymen, named after his school, and they played at church fetes and birthday parties, making a joyful, ramshackle noise. On July 6, 1957, they played at the Garden Fete of St. Peter's Church in Woolton, and afterward, in the church hall, a mutual friend introduced John to Paul McCartney, who was 15 and baby-faced and had shown up with his guitar. Paul knew all the words to Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, which impressed John because John could never remember lyrics and usually just made them up. Paul also showed him how to tune a guitar properly. John was older and tougher and the leader, but Paul clearly knew more about music. John invited him to join the group, though it took a couple of weeks for him to make the offer, because he understood that adding Paul might mean he wouldn't be the unquestioned center of things anymore. But the music mattered more than his pride, or just enough more, and so Paul joined. Paul brought George in early the next year. George was only 14, but could play guitar better than anyone else they knew. He could play the solos, the lead lines that gave the songs their shape. John thought George was too young, a baby, but George played Ratatouille for him on the top deck of a bus, and that was enough. The Quarrymen became a trio, though the name and the lineup kept shifting. They played at the Casbah Coffee Club, which was run by Mona Best in the basement of her large house in West Derby. They played at small clubs in Liverpool, rarely getting paid, learning by doing. Rock and roll had no manual, no conservatory. You learned by imitation and repetition, playing 5 sets a night until your fingers cramped and your voice went hoarse and the songs became automatic, which freed you to do something else inside them, something that was yours. In 1960, they needed a drummer and a bass player. John's art school friend, Stuart Sutcliffe, bought a bass with money he'd won in a painting competition and joined the band even though he couldn't really play it yet. He was beautiful, with dark eyes and a moody James Dean intensity, and John adored him. Paul was privately annoyed because Stuart wasn't good enough, and because John's attention had shifted. Around the same time, they found a drummer named Pete Bestmona, Best's son, who was handsome and steady and available. They also needed a new name. They'd been calling themselves Johnny and the Moondogs, then the Silver Beatles, cycling through variations. John liked the reference to Buddy Holly's Crickets, insects as band names, but he also wanted a pun, something with beat in it, the Beat Generation, the beat of the music, the Beatles, Beatles that could spell. It was silly and it was perfect. An agent named Alan Williams got them a booking in Hamburg, in West Germany, where the club owners wanted live rock and roll bands to play for hours on end in the loud, lawless bars of the Reeperbahn, the red light district. In August of 1960, they drove to Hamburg in a cramped van and found themselves in a different world. The Indra Club, then the Kaiserkeller, then the Top 10 Club, dark, sweaty rooms thick with smoke and beer and the amphetamines everyone took to stay awake. The clientele were sailors, gangsters, sex workers, American GIs, people who wanted the music loud and fast and endless. The Beatles played 8-hour sets, sometimes longer, 6 or 7 nights a week. They played every rock and roll song they knew, then learned more, then stretched songs out with long instrumental breaks and improvised madness. John would go on stage in his underwear or with a toilet seat around his neck. They shouted and stomped and made each other laugh. They got louder and tighter and stranger. Paul's bass playing improved because it had to. George's guitar grew more fluid. They learned to watch each other, to lock in, to become a unit. "Ma shaw," the club owner would shout. "Make show." And so they did, Stuart Sutcliffe fell in love with a German photographer named Astrid Kircher, who took moody black and white photographs of the band and styled Stuart's hair in a French cut, combed forward instead of slicked back. The others mocked it at first, then one by one adopted it themselves, except Pete Best, who kept his hair in a slicked quiff. Astrid and her friends dressed in black and talked about art and existentialism. They were the X's, the German bohemians, and they treated the Beatles like artists, not just a bar band. Stuart decided to stay in Hamburg to be with Astrid and to study painting. He quit the band. Paul took over bass reluctantly at first, but he was the best musician among them and he made the bass melodic, a lead instrument in its own right. They returned to Liverpool in the middle of 1961, older and stranger and far better than any other band in the city. They began playing regular lunchtime and evening shows at the Cavern Club, a small, dank basement venue on Matthew Street that was originally a jazz club, but it started booking rock and roll. The cavern was cramped and humid, the walls slick with condensation, the air thick enough to choke on, and the Beatles played there nearly 300 times over the next 2 years. The audience was young people on their lunch breaks from the shops and offices, girls who screamed, and boys who watched the guitars. The band was tight now, professional, and they had a chemistry on stage that was easy and funny and magnetic. John and Paul shared a microphone, harmonizing on the old Everly Brothers songs, their faces inches apart, and the blend of their voices was uncanny, two distinct tones that locked into a third thing, sweeter and stranger than either alone. On November 9, 1961, a man named Brian Epstein walked down the stairs into the Cavern Club to see what all the fuss was about. Epstein managed the record department at his family's furniture store, Nems, and customers kept requesting a record by a local group called the Beatles, which he didn't have in stock. He came to see them play, and what he saw was raw talent, charisma, a kind of sloppy brilliance. They wore leather jackets and jeans and smoked on stage and swore at the audience and ate snacks between songs. They were by any measure unprofessional, but there was something there. Epstein was 27, gay, closeted, from a wealthy Jewish family, educated, ambitious, and deeply lonely. He saw in the Beatles a project, maybe a purpose. He approached them about management. They were wary managers were usually crooks, but Epstein was well-spoken and had an air of competence, and they had no other prospects. On December 10th, they agreed to let him manage them, though the contract wasn't signed for weeks and was never, in the end, entirely watertight. Epstein believed the way to success was through respectability. He made them wear suits matching gray lounge suits with narrow lapels and knit ties, and he made them stop swearing and smoking on stage. He made them bow in unison at the end of each song. They resisted, especially John, who hated being told what to do and thought the whole thing was a sellout. But Epstein promised he would get them a record contract, and that was the thing they wanted most, the thing that would make them real. He took a demo tape to London and was rejected by every major label, Decca, Pi, Columbia. Decca famously told him that guitar groups were on the way out. But Epstein kept trying, and finally, through a combination of persistence and a connection via a record producer he'd met, he got an audition with George Martin at Parlophone, a small subsidiary of EMI that mostly released comedy records. George Martin was a producer, which in 1962 meant something closer to a supervisor than a creative partner. But Martin was different. He was classically trained, had worked on orchestral recordings and Peter Sellers comedy albums, and he listened to music with an arranger's ear. When the Beatles auditioned for him in June of 1962 at EMI's Abbey Road studios in London, Martin thought the songs were decent and the singing was promising, but the drummer wasn't good enough. Pete Best played a bit behind the beat, and his technique was limited. Martin told Epstein they'd need to use a session drummer for the recordings, which was standard practice but felt like a betrayal to the band. There was also a growing sense that Pete didn't quite fit. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't banter with the others. The girls loved him, he was the best-looking one, but the internal chemistry was off. On August 16, 1962, Brian Epstein fired Pete Best. The task was ugly and painful, and the reasons were multiple and never entirely clear: musical limitations, personal friction, maybe a sense that Pete's popularity threatened the group's cohesion. Pete was devastated. The fans were furious. There were protests outside the Cavern Club. Paul got a black eye in a scuffle. But the decision was made. They asked Ringo Starr, who'd been drumming for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, to join. Ringo was older, more experienced, funnier, and he fit. His drumming was simple and solid, never overplaying, always right in the pocket. And his personality completed something. John was the sharp, sarcastic one. Paul was the charming, pretty one. George was the quiet, serious one. And Ringo was the droll, lovable one. The self-deprecating clown with the sad eyes. It was a chemistry you couldn't design. It was luck. On September 4, 1962, the four of them, John, Paul, George, Ringo, recorded their first single at Abbey Road. The A-side was Love Me Do, a song John and Paul had written years earlier, simple and catchy with a harmonica riff that John played. George Martin still wasn't convinced about Ringo's drumming, so he brought in a session drummer named Andy White for the next session, which meant Ringo spent one of the most important days of his life playing tambourine and feeling humiliated. But Love Me Do was released in October and climbed to number 17 on the UK charts, which was respectable for a debut single by an unknown group. More importantly, it was a beginning. Their second single, Please Please Me, released in January of 1963, went to number 1. The song was faster, more urgent, the harmonies more confident. John sang lead, Paul joined him on the chorus, and George played a guitar riff that sounded like it was running up a staircase. George Martin heard the playback and said, "Gentlemen, you have just made your first number 1 record." They recorded their first album, also called Please Please Me, in a single marathon session on February 11, 1963, 10 songs in about 10 hours, trying to capture the energy of their live show. John was sick with a cold, and you can hear it in his voice on Twist and Shout, the last song they recorded, his throat raw and shredded, screaming himself hoarse on a cover of an old Isley Brothers song. The album went to number 1 and stayed there for 30 weeks. What happened next happened quickly, though at the time it must have felt both inevitable and utterly strange. The singles kept coming, From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and each one went to number 1, and the girls started screaming, not polite applause, but screaming, hysterical, weeping, fainting, a sound like nothing anyone had heard before. Beatlemania, the press called it, as if it were a disease. The band played theaters and concert halls, and the noise was so loud they couldn't hear the monitors, could barely hear each other. The music became irrelevant. The screaming was the point. The girls wanted to be close to something, to touch it, to dissolve into it. The Beatles were young and funny and non-threatening, and theirs, not their parents'. They smiled and waved and made jokes on television, and they didn't condescend. They were working-class boys from Liverpool who'd gotten lucky, and they seemed to know it, and that made them lovable. In early 1964, they went to America. I Want to Hold Your Hand had gone to number 1 in the U.S., and Ed Sullivan invited them on his television show, which was the center of American culture at the time, the hearth everyone gathered around. On February 9, 1964, 73 million people watched the Beatles perform 5 songs on The Ed Sullivan Show, and American culture tilted. They were funny in the pre-show interviews, quick and irreverent. "Are you going to get a haircut?" a reporter asked. "I just had one yesterday," George said. "They played All My Loving and Till There Was You and She Loves You and the She Loves You, and the camera cut to girls in the audience crying, and something shifted. The British invasion began, but more than that, the idea that rock and roll could be joyful and intelligent and mass culture at the same time, that idea took hold. The schedule was punishing, 2 or 3 albums a year, constant touring, press conferences, photo shoots, film shoots. In 1964, they made A Hard Day's Night, a black-and-white film directed by Richard Lester that was supposed to be a cheap cash-in on their fame, but turned out to be a witty, innovative piece of cinema, full of jump cuts and absurdist humor. The soundtrack was the first album to consist entirely of original songs, all of them written by John and Paul, and it showed how quickly they were developing as songwriters. If I Fell was a ballad with a complex bridge and shifting harmonies. And I Love Her was simple and perfect, Paul's melody riding over George's nylon string guitar. A Hard Day's Night itself had a guitar chord that rang out like a bell, impossible to place, a jangling mystery that became as famous as the song itself. George played it on a 12-string Rickenbacker, but there was also a piano in there, and maybe a bass, and the exact combination has been debated ever since. It didn't matter. It sounded like excitement. It sounded like excitement. It sounded like excitement. They toured the world, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Europe, America, again and again. They played Shea Stadium in August of 1965, 55,000 people, the first rock concert in a stadium, and the screaming was so loud it was like standing inside a jet engine. They couldn't hear a single note they played. John later said he could have been playing anything and no one would have known. The performance became a pantomime, a ritual. The music was secondary, almost incidental. This bothered them more and more. They were musicians, or they thought of themselves that way, and the live show had become a parody of music, a freak show. They were trapped inside their fame, unable to walk down the street, locked in hotel rooms, surrounded by handlers and police. Paul said later that they used to hold hands running from the car to the stage, genuinely frightened they'd be torn apart. In the studio, though, they were beginning to discover what was possible. George Martin was the crucial enabler here, the adult who took them seriously and who had the technical knowledge to translate their ideas into sound. The Beatles couldn't read music, couldn't write out a score, but they could hear things in their heads and describe them. Can you make it sound more purple? Can it sound like the end of the world? And Martin would nod and figure out how to do it. He brought in classical musicians for Yesterday, a string quartet playing a simple, aching arrangement under Paul's voice and acoustic guitar. It was the first time they'd used outside musicians on a track, and it was Paul's song entirely. None of the others played on it, which was the beginning of a fracture that would take years to widen into a break. But the song was undeniable, maybe the most covered song in history, a melody so natural it had always existed. Paul said he woke up with it in his head and spent weeks convinced he'd unconsciously stolen it from somewhere. Rubber Soul, released in December of 1965, was the album where they stopped being a pop group and started being artists, though they wouldn't have used that word. The songs were more introspective, the arrangements more varied. Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, had George playing a sitar, the first time the instrument had been used in a Western pop song, a droning nasal sound that gave the song an Eastern tinge and opened a door that George would walk through for the rest of his life. In My Life was a Lennon song, nostalgic and tender, about memory and loss, with a piano solo in the middle that sounded like a harpsichord, which George Martin played and then sped up on the tape to give it a glassy antique quality. Michelle was Paul singing in French, romantic and slightly silly and utterly beautiful. The album cover showed their faces in shadow, unsmiling, serious. They looked older. They were. By the summer of 1966, they were exhausted and unraveling. The touring was unbearable. In March, John gave an interview to a London journalist and said offhandedly that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, which was probably true but not something you were supposed to say out loud. The quote was mostly ignored in the UK, but when it was reprinted in an American teen magazine in July, the reaction was violent. The Bible Belt erupted. Radio stations organized Beatles bonfires burning their records. The Ku Klux Klan protested outside their concerts. John apologized, sort of, saying he'd been misunderstood, but the damage was done. The American tour that summer was hostile and frightening. In Memphis, someone threw a firecracker on stage, and for a second they all thought it was a gunshot, After the final show at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966, they walked off stage and never toured again. The decision wasn't announced immediately, but they knew it was over, that part of it. What replaced it was the studio. If they couldn't play live, they would make records that couldn't be played live. Records that used the studio itself as an instrument. They had begun this on Rubber Soul, but with Revolver, released in August of 1966, they went further. Eleanor Rigby had no Beatles playing instruments at all, just Paul singing over a string octet arranged by George Martin, and the song was a miniature piece of theater, a portrait of loneliness in 2 verses and a chorus. For No One was another Paul song, small and devastating, with a French horn solo played by Alan Civil of the London Philharmonic. Here, There, and Everywhere was Paul's attempt to write something as beautiful as Brian Wilson's God Only Knows, and he succeeded, a melody that seemed to float, weightless. George contributed 3 songs, including Taxman, which opened the album with a snarl about the British tax rate and a scorching guitar solo that Paul actually played because George couldn't quite nail it, which must have stung. But the song that pointed toward the future was Tomorrow Never Knows, the final track, a Lennon song based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the LSD trips he'd been taking. John wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop, and George Martin ran it through a rotating Leslie speaker to give it a swirling, disembodied quality. The band created tape loops, fragments of sound recorded on tape, cut into loops, and played backward or at different speeds and fed them into the mix, creating a dense, hallucinogenic soundscape. Ringo's drum beat was relentless, circular, hypnotic. The song didn't follow verse-chorus structure. It just was, a 5-minute mantric drone that sounded like nothing else in pop music. It was avant-garde, it was experimental, and it was on a Beatles album, which meant millions of people heard it. The door was open now. Anything was possible. They spent the first half of 1967 making their next album, which became Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the mythology around it is so thick it's hard to see the actual object anymore. At the time, the idea was simple. They would create a fictional band, Sgt. Pepper's Band, and this alter ego would free them from being the Beatles, from the expectations and the history. They would dress in bright Victorian military uniforms, they would fill the album with sound effects and studio trickery, and they would make something that was a complete experience, not just a collection of songs. The album took over 700 hours of studio time, which was unheard of, and cost over £25,000, which was a fortune. George Martin and the engineering staff at Abbey Road had to invent techniques to achieve what the band wanted, bouncing tracks back and forth between 4-track machines to create more layers, splicing tape by hand, recording orchestras and fairground organs. A Day in the Life was the final song recorded, a Lennon song and a McCartney song stitched together with an orchestral crescendo in the middle that was pure chaos. 41 musicians instructed to start at the lowest note on their instrument and climb to the highest over the course of 24 bars, all of them arriving at different times, creating a wave of sound that built and built until it felt like the end of the world. The final chord was all 4 Beatles and George Martin hitting E major on 3 pianos simultaneously, a sound that rang out for over 40 seconds, fading into silence. The song was about mundane life and cosmic dread, about reading the news and blowing your mind, and it was unlike anything anyone had done in popular music. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a psychedelic fairy tale, dreamy and strange, with images that dripped and melted tangerine trees, marmalade skies, cellophane flowers. Everyone assumed it was about LSD, and maybe it was, but John always insisted it came from a drawing his son Julian had brought home from school, a picture of a classmate named Lucy. She's Leaving Home was Paul's song, another miniature drama about a girl running away from her parents, with a harp and a string arrangement and no band instruments at all. George contributed Within You Without You, a long, droning meditation with Indian instruments, sitars and tablas, about the illusion of separateness, and it divided listeners immediately. Some found it profound, others pretentious. It didn't matter. George had been studying with Ravi Shankar, the great Indian classical musician, and he was trying to do something serious, to integrate Eastern philosophy and music into his work, and whether it succeeded or not, the ambition was real. The album was released on June 1, 1967, and the cover was as famous as the musica collage designed by Peter Blake, showing the Beatles in their bright uniforms, standing in front of a crowd of life-sized cardboard cutouts, a pantheon of heroes and icons chosen by the band: Marlon Brando, Bob Dylan, Marilyn Monroe, Oscar Wilde, Karl Marx, W.C. Fields, Aldous Huxley, Edgar Allan Poe, dozens more. It looked like a funeral for the old Beatles, a gathering to mark the death of the Mop-Tops and the birth of something stranger. The album was a commercial and critical phenomenon. It was called a masterpiece, the first concept album, the moment rock music became art. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys heard it and abandoned the album he was working on, feeling he couldn't compete. The Beatles themselves felt they'd achieved something, but also that they'd set a standard they might not be able to maintain. The innocence was gone. They were expected to be geniuses now. In August of 1967, they met the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a small man in white robes who taught transcendental meditation and promised inner peace through mantra and meditation practice. The Beatles were searching for something, some meaning or grounding that fame and drugs hadn't provided, and the Maharishi seemed to offer it. They attended his lectures in Wales, and they were enthralled, or at least open. George had been moving toward Eastern spirituality for years. John was looking for answers. Paul was willing to try. Ringo went along because the others did. They spoke about studying with the Maharishi in India, going to his ashram in Rishikesh to meditate and study and escape the madness of their lives. But first, in late August, Brian Epstein died. He was found in his London home, dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose, though there were rumors of suicide. Epstein had been struggling. His management contract with the Beatles was coming up for renewal, and he worried they didn't need him anymore. He was using pills and drinking heavily. His personal life was a series of brief, desperate encounters, and he'd been beaten and blackmailed more than once for being gay. The Beatles were devastated. Brian had been the adult, the one who handled the business, who protected them from the machinery of fame. Without him, they were adrift. John said later that they knew they were in trouble the moment Brian died, that the center had collapsed, and they just didn't realize it yet. They tried to hold it together. Paul took charge, which John resented. Paul organized the Magical Mystery Tour project, a television film that they would write and direct themselves, filming a bus trip through the English countryside with a cast of eccentric characters and no real script. It was meant to be spontaneous and fun, a lark, but it was a mess. The film aired on BBC television on Boxing Day 1967 and was savaged by critics. It was their first failure, and it stung. The soundtrack, though, had some of their best songs: Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, recorded earlier in the year and released as a double A-side single, were twin portraits of Liverpool childhood, one hazy and unsettling, the other bright and nostalgic. I Am the Walrus was John's surrealist masterpiece, full of nonsense lyrics and cryptic images. Goo 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 Joe, sitting on a cornflake, yellow matter custard sung over a chaotic arrangement of strings and horns and a radio tune to a BBC broadcast of King Lear. John had been reading Lewis Carroll and James Joyce and taking a lot of acid, and he wanted to make something that couldn't be analyzed, that would frustrate anyone trying to find meaning in Beatles lyrics. In February of 1968, they flew to Rishikesh, India, to study with the Maharishi at his ashram on the banks of the Ganges. They brought their wives and girlfriends. John brought Cynthia, Paul brought Jane Asher, George brought Pattie Boyd. Ringo brought Maureen. Dozens of other Western seekers were there. including Mike Love of the Beach Boys, and Mia Farrow and her sister Prudence, who would inspire a song. The ashram was a compound of bungalows and lecture halls, simple and peaceful, surrounded by jungle. The routine was meditation twice a day, vegetarian meals, lectures on consciousness and transcendence, no alcohol, no drugs, though John smuggled in some marijuana. They wrote songs, dozens of them sitting on the flat roofs of their bungalows with their acoustic guitars, the most productive songwriting period they'd ever had. The escape from the modern world, the simplicity, the lack of distractions, it opened something up. But it fell apart. Ringo left after 10 days because he couldn't handle the food and missed his kids. Paul left after a month, feeling he'd learned what he came to learn. John and George stayed longer, but then rumors started circulating the Maharishi had made a pass at a young woman in the group, or maybe more than one. The stories were murky and disputed, but John, who needed his heroes to be pure, turned on the Maharishi with the same intensity he'd once embraced him. He wrote a song called Maharishi, full of anger and disillusionment, though he later changed the title to Sexy Sadie to avoid legal trouble. George was more circumspect, unwilling to throw out the teachings because of one man's failings, and this created a friction between him and John. They flew back to England in April, sunburned and bearded and carrying notebooks full of songs. They also came back to a new world. John had grown closer to Yoko Ono, a Japanese avant-garde artist he'd met at one of her gallery shows in 1966. Yoko was 7 years older than John, tiny and intense, an established figure in the New York art world who made conceptual pieces and performance art and strange experimental music. She was everything Cynthia wasn't: intellectual, confrontational, uninterested in being likable. John was obsessed. In May of 1968, while Cynthia was on vacation, John invited Yoko to his house in Weybridge, and they stayed up all night making an experimental tape collage, and then they made love at dawn. Cynthia came home to find Yoko in her house, in her bathrobe, and the marriage was over. John and Yoko became inseparable, joined at the hip, and John brought her to the recording sessions for the new album, which was an unthinkable breach of protocol. The studio had always been the band's private space. No wives or girlfriends allowed, but John didn't care. Yoko sat beside him, sometimes offering opinions, and the others seethed. The album they made that summer, eventually called The Beatles but known as the White Album because of its plain white cover, was a sprawling double LP, 30 songs, everything from delicate acoustic ballads to screaming proto-punk to avant-garde noise. It was the most diverse thing they'd ever done, and also the most fragmented. There was no unifying vision, no concept. It was 4 individuals making their own songs and using the band as backing musicians. Back in the USSR was a Paul song, a pastiche of the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry, light and fun. Blackbird was Paul alone with an acoustic guitar, singing about the civil rights movement, or about a bird, or both, while My Guitar Gently Weeps was George's song, with a guitar solo played by his friend Eric Clapton, whom George invited into the studio because he thought it might make the others behave more professionally. It did, for that session. Revolution 9 was John and Yoko's 8-minute sound collage, a chaotic tape loop experiment that was closer to musique concrète than rock music. The others hated it. Paul tried to keep it off the album, but John insisted, and it stayed, a bizarre artifact of his avant-garde ambitions and his desire to prove he was an artist, not just a Beatle. Helter Skelter was Paul's attempt to make the loudest, dirtiest, most chaotic rock song possible, inspired by a quote from The Who about how heavy their new song was. Paul wanted to out-heavy them, and the result was a proto-metal shriek, Ringo screaming, "I've got blisters on my fingers," at the end of one take. Julia was John's most tender song, a lullaby for his dead mother, just his voice and his acoustic guitar, no one else. Happiness is a Warm Gun was John's most complex song structurally, shifting through multiple sections and time signatures, a song about sex and violence and addiction, and maybe the comfort of Yoko. The sessions were miserable. The four of them barely functioned as a unit anymore. They recorded in different studios at different times, often without all four members present. George quit for a few days in January during the sessions that would lead to the Let It Be project, walking out after an argument with Paul about how to play a guitar part. Ringo quit in August, feeling isolated and unappreciated, and when he came back 2 weeks later he found his drum kit covered in flowers, a gesture of apology from the others. But the flowers couldn't hide the fact that they were falling apart. They still made great music sometimes, but the process was poisoned. In January of 1969, they tried to get back to basics. Paul's idea was to rehearse a bunch of new songs, play a live concert, their first in over 2 years, and film the whole process for a documentary. It would be a return to simplicity, to the purity of four guys playing rock and roll. They set up cameras and microphones in a cold, drafty soundstage at Twickenham Studios and started rehearsing. It was a disaster. The cameras captured every moment of tension, every disagreement, every long silence. George and Paul argued constantly. John was distant, more interested in whispering with Yoko than engaging with the band. Ringo looked miserable. George quit again, and this time it took days of negotiation to get him back. One of the conditions of his return was that they move out of Twickenham and into their own Apple Corps recording studio in the basement of their Savile Row office building. Another condition was that they bring in Billy Preston, an American keyboard player they'd known from the Hamburg days, to play with them. Preston's presence eased the tension slightly. They were nicer to each other when an outsider was watching. On January 30th, 1969, they played their last public performance, an unannounced concert on the rooftop of the Apple building. They set up their equipment on the roof and played for 42 minutes, running through new songs, Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, One After 9:09, while office workers on nearby rooftops stopped to watch and the street below filled with people craning their necks. The police eventually shut it down, noise complaints, and the concert ended with John saying, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition." It was a perfect ending, though no one knew it was an ending at the time. The footage would eventually be used in the Let It Be film, which wouldn't be released until May of 1970 after they'd broken up, and the whole thing would be remembered as a sad document of a band's dissolution. Though, if you watch it now, you can also see moments of joy, the four of them locking in on a groove, smiling despite themselves. They made one more album, though the sessions were calmer, almost professional. In the summer of 1969, they returned to Abbey Road and worked with George Martin again, and the result was Abbey Road, released in September. The cover was iconic. The four of them walking across a zebra crossing outside the studio, Paul barefoot, a white Volkswagen Beetle parked in the background. Conspiracy theorists would later claim the image was full of clues about Paul's supposed death, which had become a strange urban legend. The album itself was a kind of farewell, though no one said so explicitly. Side 1 had individual songs, some of their best, Come Together, John's swampy blues with cryptic lyrics, Something, George's most beautiful love song, which Frank Sinatra would later call the greatest love song of the century. Here Comes the Sun, George's ode to spring and relief after a long winter. Side 2 was a medley, a suite of short song fragments stitched together into a continuous piece. Paul's idea, a way of using up the scraps and creating something cohesive. It worked. The medley, You Never Give Me Your Money, Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, Polithari, Tenny Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Golden Slumbers, Carried Out Weight, The End, flowed like a dream, building to a final crescendo. The End flowed like a dream, building to a final crescendo. The End featured a drum solo from Ringo, his only recorded drum solo with the Beatles, and a three-way guitar solo, John and Paul and George, trading licks, and then a final lyric, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. It was Paul's line, sentimental and true, and then there was a quiet little coda, Her Majesty, Paul singing a silly snippet of a song about the Queen, and the album ended. But that wasn't actually the last album released. Let It Be, recorded in January of '69, sat in the vaults for over a year because no one knew what to do with it. The tapes were a mess, the performances ragged, the vibe grim. Eventually, they handed it over to Phil Spector, the famous producer known for his wall of sound, and he overdubbed strings and choirs onto some of the songs, trying to make them releasable. Paul hated what Spector did to the long and winding road, drowning his piano ballad in syrupy orchestration, and he tried to stop the release, but it was too late. Let It Be came out in May of 1970, and by then the Beatles were over. The business had become unbearable. After Brian Epstein died, they'd tried to manage their own affairs, setting up Apple Corps as a multimedia company that would release records, make films, support artists, and be a kind of utopian business where creativity came first. It was a disaster. Apple lost money constantly, employees stole from them, hangers-on took advantage, they needed professional management, but they couldn't agree on who. John, George, and Ringo wanted Alan Klein, a tough New York music manager with a reputation for getting artists their money, but also for keeping a large cut for himself. Paul wanted his new father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a New York entertainment lawyer, and his son, John Eastman, to manage them. Paul had married Linda Eastman, an American photographer, in March of 1969, and the others saw this as nepotism or a power grab. The fact that Linda's family was respectable and educated made it worse somehow, a class resentment bubbling up. John had married Yoko just a week before Paul married Linda, and the two couples became symbols of the split. It was never really about Yoko or Linda, but it was easier to blame the women than to admit the four men no longer wanted the same things. John was increasingly focused on his life with Yoko, making experimental films and albums, staging bed-ins for peace, giving interviews about his childhood trauma and his primal scream therapy. Paul was focused on domestic life with Linda and their children, retreating to his farm in Scotland, writing gentle songs. George was tired of being the junior partner, tired of having his songs rejected or squeezed onto albums as token inclusions. He had a backlog of material, good material, and he wanted out. Ringo was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace, but he knew it was over too. On April 10, 1970, Paul released a press statement in the form of a self-interview included with advance copies of his first solo album. In it, he answered questions about the Beatles' future, and he said he didn't know if he'd ever record with them again, that he didn't miss them, that the break with the band was a relief. The press interpreted it as an announcement that the Beatles had split up, though Paul would later say he hadn't meant it that way or hadn't wanted to be the one to say it. But it was said. John was furious, not because it wasn't true, but because he'd wanted to be the one to announce it. He privately told the others months earlier that he wanted a divorce from the band, but they'd agreed to keep it quiet until the business issues were sorted out. Paul's statement blew that up. The recriminations were bitter. John gave interviews calling Paul's music muzak, saying he'd always been too soft. Paul gave interviews saying John was under Yoko's spell. George said he felt liberated. Ringo tried to stay neutral. The lawsuits began. Paul sued to dissolve the Beatles' legal partnership in December of 1970, the only way he could separate his finances from Klein's control. The case dragged through the courts for years. The business disputes were tangled and tedious, arguments over percentages and royalties and publishing rights, but underneath it was heartbreak and betrayal, the end of a partnership that had been the center of their lives for over a decade. They'd been brothers, or something closer than brothers, and now they couldn't be in the same room. John and Yoko moved to New York and threw themselves into political activism and avant-garde art. John made solo albums that were raw and confessional. Plastic Ono Band, where he screamed about his mother and his childhood, and Imagine, which had the title track, a song that became an anthem, soft and utopian, imagining a world without possessions or religion or countries. The song was beautiful and naive and enduring. John also made albums that were unlistenable, self-indulgent, full of primal screaming and feedback. He didn't care. He was trying to figure out who he was outside of the Beatles, and it was messy. Paul made Ram, an album with Linda that was gentle and pastoral, and mocked by critics who wanted him to be more serious, more experimental. Then he formed a new band, Wings, and spent the 70s trying to prove he didn't need the Beatles, touring constantly, writing hits, making music that was sometimes brilliant and sometimes bland, always melodic. He seemed desperate to be loved, to be successful, and he was, but the shadow of the Beatles followed him everywhere. George made All Things Must Pass, a triple album released in November of 1970, and it was a revelation. All the songs he'd stockpiled, all the songs that hadn't fit on Beatles albums, poured out in a flood. My Sweet Lord was a devotional song that blended Christian and Hindu imagery and became a massive hit, though he'd later be sued for subconsciously plagiarizing the Ronettes' He's So Fine. Isn't It a Pity was a long, mournful meditation on human cruelty and forgiveness. The album was produced by Phil Spector, and the sound was huge, walls of guitars and keyboards and backing vocals, everything drenched in reverb. It was sprawling and uneven and deeply felt, and it was the best solo album any of them made, proof that George had been held back, that he'd had more to give than the Beatles had allowed him to give. Ringo made albums too, some good, some not, and he acted in films and narrated children's shows. He was the most well-adjusted of the four, or at least he seemed to be, self-deprecating and funny, and happy to be the luckiest man alive. He'd been invited to join the greatest band in history, and he played his part, and now he was free to do whatever he wanted. He didn't carry the weight of genius. It was a gift. In December of 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed by a man named Mark David Chapman outside the Dakota apartment building in New York City. John and Yoko had recently released a new album, Double Fantasy, after 5 years of John staying home to raise their son Sean. The album was about domestic happiness, about baking bread and watching the sunrise, and John had been giving interviews about how content he was, how he'd finally figured out how to live. And then Chapman, a disturbed young man who'd been obsessed with John and the Beatles and the book The Catcher in the Rye, waited outside the Dakota with a gun and shot him 4 times in the back. John was 40 years old. The world stopped. The grief was immediate and global. Vigils were held in every city. Radio stations played Beatles songs on a loop. The other 3 Beatles didn't speak publicly for days. Paul, when he finally did, said, "It's a drag," and was mocked for the understatement, but what was he supposed to say? His best friend, his partner, his rival, the person he'd harmonized with, argued with, created with, for over 20 years, was gone. George said he was devastated. Ringo flew to New York to be with Yoko and Sean. The murder felt like the final, horrible punctuation on the Beatles' story, the end of the 60s dream, the confirmation that nothing beautiful lasts. George continued making music, though he grew reclusive, retreating to his estate in Henley-on-Thames, gardening, meditating, racing cars. He joined the Traveling Wilburys in the late 80s, a supergroup with Bob Dylan and Tom Petty and Roy Orbison and Jeff Lynne, and he seemed to enjoy the lack of pressure, being part of a band where he wasn't the star or the martyr. In November of 2001, George died of cancer. He was 58. He'd been fighting it for years, lung cancer that spread to his brain, and he faced it with a kind of calm acceptance, his Hindu faith giving him a framework for understanding death as a transition, not an end. Paul and Ringo were with him at the end. Paul and Ringo are still here, as of this telling, still making music, still touring, still living inside the long shadow of the Beatles. Paul has never stopped working, writing, performing, as if the work itself is what keeps him alive. Ringo tours with his all-star band, a rotating lineup of aging rock musicians, and he seems genuinely happy, still playing the drums, still making people smile. They occasionally collaborate, a track here or there, a public appearance, but they are not the Beatles. The Beatles were the 4 of them, and half of them are gone, and what remains is the music and the myth. The myth is larger than the reality ever was. The Beatles have sold more records than any other artist in history, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. Their music has been streamed billions of times. Every year, new generations discover them, and the songs still work, still sound fresh, which is the strangest thing. Yesterday, and Hey Jude, and Let It Be, and Here Comes the Sun are played at weddings and funerals, in elevators and shopping malls, and they have become so ubiquitous that they're almost invisible, part of the texture of the world. It's easy to forget that someone wrote them, that 4 young men from Liverpool sat in a room and put notes together in a particular order and created something that outlasted them. The arguments about the Beatles have never stopped. Who was the genius, John or Paul? Was George underrated? Was Ringo a great drummer or just a lucky one? Did they sell out when they wore suits, or did they save rock and roll? Was Sgt. Pepper's overrated? Is the White Album their best, or their most indulgent? Did Yoko break up the band, or was the band already broken? These are the questions fans argue about, and they will never be resolved, because the answers depend on what you value, what you hear, what you bring to the music. What seems undeniable is that the Beatles transformed popular music from entertainment into art, or at least they convinced the world that it could be both at once. Before them, rock and roll was singles, 3-minute bursts of energy, disposable and thrilling. After them, albums were statements, coherent works that people listened to from beginning to end. They made the studio a creative tool, not just a place to document live performances. They proved that you could be experimental and popular, that you could challenge your audience and keep them. They opened doors for everyone who came after. But they were also just 4 people who wanted to play music, who met by luck in a city by the sea, who worked hard and got lucky and caught the wave of a cultural moment. They were not saints. They were often cruel to each other, jealous, petty. They made bad decisions. They hurt people. John could be vicious, mocking anyone who showed weakness. Paul could be controlling, condescending. George could be self-righteous. Ringo could be passive-aggressive. They were flawed, like anyone. But when they played together, something happened. The voices blended. The instruments locked in. The songs appeared. The songs are what remain. I Want to Hold Your Hand still sounds like excitement. In My Life still sounds like excitement. In My Life still sounds like excitement. A Day in the Life still sounds like the moment before everything changes. Let It Be still sounds like comfort, even if you don't believe in Mother Mary or anything else. The songs have been absorbed into the culture so completely that it's hard to imagine a world without them. But there was a world without them. And then 4 young men from Liverpool made them. And now we have them. And we'll keep having them long after everyone who remembers the Beatles firsthand is gone. Paul McCartney said once that the Beatles were like a family, and like any family, they loved each other and drove each other crazy and eventually grew apart. That's a generous way of putting it. The truth is messier. They made something that was bigger than any of them, and then they couldn't carry the weight of it, and it collapsed, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to figure out what it had meant. John spent his last years insisting he was happy to be free of the band, but he also kept writing songs about Paul, about the partnership, about the loss. Paul spent decades defending his role, trying to get credit for the work he'd done, insisting he wasn't just the cute one. George spent his life trying to step out of their shadow, to be seen as an equal. Ringo accepted his role as the 4th Beatle, the lucky one, and maybe that's why he's the happiest. In the end, the Beatles were a moment, a particular combination of people and place and time that can't be recreated. They were 4 boys who became famous before they'd finished growing up, who were locked together in the pressure cooker of global fame, who made art in the brief spaces between obligations, and who finally couldn't stand each other anymore. They fell apart because people change, and relationships end, and the thing that brought you together can become the thing that traps you. But for 8 years, they made music together, and that music was alive in a way that music rarely is, and it still is. The sun is coming up now, over the rooftop of the Apple building, over Abbey Road, over the Cavern Club's ruins, over the city of Liverpool, where it all started. The songs are still playing somewhere, on someone's radio, on someone's phone, in someone's memory. 4 voices blending, guitars chiming, drums keeping time. The greatest pop act in history, gone and still here, the perfect thing destroyed and somehow still intact, still singing, still asking us to hold their hand, to come together, to let it be. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make.